Elias Thorne wasn't used to being tired. Not really. He'd built his company from a cramped office above a laundromat into a global logistics empire with offices in 17 countries. At 42, he owned more than most people dreamed of. Private jets, a penthouse that overlooked Central Park, watches that cost more than a car, but sleep still eluded him like a ghost he could never quite catch. Tonight was worse than usual. He'd just wrapped up a brutal 12-hour negotiation with a European shipping conglomerate, the kind of meeting where every word felt like a landmine, and one wrong syllable could cost millions. His head throbbed, his suit jacket was crumpled, and the espresso he'd downed in the car on the way home sat like acid in his stomach. Still, he couldn't bring himself to go to bed. Something about the silence of the penthouse, the too-perfect stillness, made his mind race faster, not slower. So he kicked off his shoes, loosened his tie, and collapsed onto the cream-colored sofa in the living room. The city lights flickered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting soft gold stripes across the marble floor. He closed his eyes not to sleep but just to rest, to stop thinking for 5 damn minutes. That's when he heard the soft click of the service elevator. He didn't open his eyes, but his body tensed. It was past midnight. Who was still awake? Then came the whisper-quiet footsteps, barely there, like someone trying not to exist. He knew who it was. The new maid, the quiet one. She'd started 2 weeks ago, hired through an agency that specialized in discreet domestic staff for high-net-worth individuals. He hadn't paid much attention during the onboarding, just nodded while his house manager listed her credentials. Fluent in English and Mandarin, trained in fine home care, no criminal record, references verified. She barely spoke during the brief introduction, just kept her eyes down and gave a small bow. He'd barely registered her face, just remembered how small she seemed in the vastness of his entryway, like a sparrow that had accidentally flown into a cathedral. Since then, she'd been invisible. Dishes appeared clean, linens smelled faintly of lavender, dust vanished without a trace. He never saw her working, only the results, but lately his head of security had mentioned something odd. Not a theft, nothing was missing, but a feeling. She's too careful, the man had said, like she's afraid to breathe too loud. And in Elias's world, fear often hid secrets. He'd had a maid once before who'd seemed just as quiet. Turned out she'd been photographing documents off his desk and selling them to a competitor. It took months to trace the leak back to her. He'd fired her on the spot, of course, but the damage was done. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild, especially when you lived in a glass tower with more enemies than friends. So tonight, as those soft footsteps moved closer, Elias made a decision. He wouldn't move. He wouldn't speak. He'd pretend to be asleep, just long enough to see what she really did when no one was watching. He slowed his breathing, let his shoulders go slack, and kept his eyes shut. The footsteps stopped near the doorway. A pause, then the gentle rustle of fabric, probably her uniform, a simple gray dress the agency provided. He heard the soft clink of a cleaning caddy being set down. A spray bottle hissed once. Then silence again, except for the distant wail of a siren somewhere downtown. He waited. Minutes passed. Nothing suspicious. No drawers opening. No rustling through his briefcase. No phone camera snapping pictures of his desk. Just the quiet, rhythmic sound of a cloth wiping down the coffee table. He almost felt foolish. Maybe she really was just a maid, doing her job. But then she moved toward the far corner of the room, and that's when his curiosity sharpened into something else. Because the far corner held the piano. Not just any piano, a grand Steinway, black as midnight, polished to a mirror shine. It had belonged to his mother. She'd played it every evening after dinner when he was a boy, filling their old brownstone with Chopin and lullabies. After she passed, he'd had it moved here more out of guilt than love. He hadn't touched it in over a decade. Couldn't bring himself to. Dust had settled on the lid like a shroud. He heard the soft creak of the piano bench being pulled out. Then another pause, longer this time. He risked the tiniest peek through his lashes. She was standing beside the piano, hands folded in front of her, head slightly bowed. Not cleaning, not even looking at the surface, just staring at it, like it held a memory she recognized. Then slowly, She reached out and lifted the fallboard, the wooden cover over the keys. The hinges made a soft sigh. Elias held his breath. She didn't grab anything, didn't rifle through the bench for hidden papers. Instead, she took a clean microfiber cloth from her caddy and began dusting the keys with the kind of care usually reserved for handling newborns. Each key got its own gentle stroke, no rush, no distraction, and then she sat, not to clean, not to rest. She placed her fingers lightly on the keys. For a long moment, nothing happened. She just sat there, eyes closed, as if listening to something only she could hear. Then, so softly it barely registered over the hum of the building's HVAC system, she played 3 notes C, E, G, A simple chord, warm, sad, familiar. Elias's chest tightened. It was the opening of Brahms's Lullaby, his mother's favorite, the song she'd hummed to him when he had nightmares. The same tune she'd played the night before her last surgery, when she knew she wouldn't wake up. He hadn't heard it in 20 years. Now, here it was, played by a woman he barely knew in the middle of the night, in a room where no one was supposed to be listening. She played it again, a little fuller this time, still quiet, still careful, but with a tenderness that made his throat ache. Her fingers moved with a natural grace like she'd been playing her whole life. He didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't dare blink, because in that moment, everything he thought he knew about her and about himself shifted. This wasn't espionage. This wasn't theft. This was something far more dangerous. It was humanity. And Elias Thorne, who had spent his entire adult life building walls, found himself frozen, not by suspicion, but by something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Wonder. She played for maybe 30 seconds, then stopped, lowered her hands, closed the fallboard with the same reverence she'd opened it. She stood, smoothed her dress, and picked up her caddy. As she turned to leave, she glanced toward the sofa. For a heartbeat, their eyes almost met, but Elias kept his breathing slow, his face relaxed. He didn't flinch, didn't react. She must have believed he was truly asleep, because she gave the tiniest nod, almost like an apology, and walked out as quietly as she'd come. The service elevator doors closed with a soft, chiming silence returned, but the room didn't feel empty anymore. Elias opened his eyes fully now, staring at the piano. The dust was gone. The keys gleamed under the ambient light, and the air still held the ghost of that lullaby hanging like a question. Who was she, really? And why did a simple song feel like a key turning in a lock he didn't even know existed? He sat up slowly, rubbing his temples. The headache was gone. In its place was a strange, quiet ache, something deeper than fatigue. He walked over to the piano and ran a hand over the polished wood. Cold, smooth, alive, somehow. He didn't play. He didn't know how. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was standing in a museum of his own. Success, he felt like he was standing in a home, and that scared him more than any corporate raid ever had. Because homes required care, vulnerability, presence, things he'd spent decades avoiding. He glanced toward the hallway where she'd disappeared. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow he'd find out more. Not as a CEO testing an employee, but as a man who'd just been handed a gift he didn't deserve and had no idea how to accept. For now, he turned off the lights, left the piano uncovered, and walked to his bedroom, but he didn't sleep. He listened, just in case she came back, just in case the lullaby returned. And somewhere deep down, beneath the armor of power and control, a part of him hoped it would. The next morning came too soon. Sunlight poured through the window, sharp and golden, slicing across the marble floor like a blade. He hadn't slept, not really. Just drifted in and out, haunted by the echo of 3 simple notes. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her hands on the piano keys, gentle and sure, like she belonged there more than he did in his own home. He showered, dressed in a crisp white shirt and charcoal trousers, no tie today, and made coffee himself, something he rarely did. The penthouse staff usually handled everything before he woke. But today he wanted quiet. He wanted to think. He sat at the breakfast bar, staring out at the skyline, mug warming his palms. The city buzzed below, taxis honking, delivery trucks double-parked, people rushing to jobs they probably hated. Normal life. Messy, loud, real. He'd built an empire to escape that chaos, only to realize too late that in doing so, he'd also sealed himself off from everything that made life feel alive. His phone buzzed. A message from his assistant. Board meeting moved to 3 p.m. Preliminary merger docs attached. He skimmed them without reading, his mind still back in the living room in the hush of midnight. In the space between those piano notes, he needed to see her again. Not to interrogate, not to test, just to understand, but how? He couldn't just corner her in the hallway and ask, "Why did you play my mother's lullaby?" That would sound unhinged. Or worse, like he'd been spying. Which technically he had. So he waited. He canceled his morning calls, something that sent ripples through his office. Personal matter, he told his assistant. No explanation. None needed. He was the boss. He could vanish for a week if he wanted. By early afternoon, he heard the soft clatter of the service elevator again. His pulse jumped, though he told himself it was just caffeine. She entered the living room with the same quiet grace as before. Gray dress, hair neatly pinned back, cleaning caddy in hand. She didn't look up. Didn't seem to notice him sitting by the window with a book he wasn't reading. He watched as she moved through the space like a shadow, dusting shelves, wiping glass surfaces, fluffing cushions, efficient, invisible. But now he saw more. The slight slump in her shoulders. The way she rubbed her lower back when she thought no one was looking. The dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. This wasn't just a job for her. It was survival. He stayed silent, letting her work. But this time he didn't pretend to be occupied. He just watched. Not like a CEO watching an employee, but like a person watching another person trying to hold themselves together. When she reached the piano, she paused again. He held his breath. She didn't open it this time. Just ran a cloth over the lid, her touch lingering a second longer than necessary. Then she moved on. Later, while she was in the kitchen refilling her spray bottle, he walked over to the piano and lifted the fallboard himself. The keys gleamed, still clean from last night. He ran a finger over middle C. It didn't make a sound, he didn't press hard enough, but the memory of her playing it flooded back. That evening, he did something unusual. He stayed home. No dinners with investors, no late-night strategy sessions. Just him, the penthouse, and the growing need to know who she really was. He didn't pretend to sleep this time. He sat in the armchair near the window, lights dimmed, book open on his lap. If she came, he'd be awake. And he'd be honest, she arrived just after 11. This time she saw him right away. Her steps faltered. Her eyes widened slightly, just a flicker, before she lowered them again. "I'm sorry, sir," she said softly. "I didn't realize you were still up. I can come back later." "No," he said, surprising himself with how gentle his voice sounded. "It's fine. Keep working." She nodded, but moved more stiffly now, like every motion had to be measured twice. He hated that. Hated that his presence made her feel like she had to shrink even smaller. He waited until she finished the coffee table, then spoke again. "You play piano." It wasn't a question, just a statement, quiet, neutral. She froze. Her hands gripped the edge of her cloth. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, barely above a whisper, "I used to. Last night. I heard you." She turned slowly, eyes wide with something between fear and shame. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I thought you were asleep. I won't do it again." "It wasn't a disturbance," he said quickly. "It was nice." She looked at him like she didn't believe him. Like kindness was a trick. "I'm sorry," she said again. "It was wrong of me to touch it." "It's not my place. Why that song?" he asked before he could stop himself. Her breath caught. She looked down at her hands, twisting the cloth between her fingers. "It's an old song. My mother used to sing it." He didn't say anything. Just waited. After a long pause, she added, "She passed away when I was young. I only remember bits of her voice. But that melody, it stayed." He nodded slowly. "Mine too." She looked up, surprised. "My mother played that same lullaby," he said. "Every night before bed, until she got sick." Something shifted in her expression then. Not pity, not curiosity, recognition. Like two people finding the same scar in the dark. "I didn't know," she said softly. "You couldn't have." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't heavy. It felt shared. He gestured to the piano. "Do you still play?" She shook her head. "Not really. I haven't had access to one in years, just sometimes if I see a piano, I imagine the notes. It helps. Helps with what? She hesitated. Then, with a small, tired smile, with missing her. He understood that more than he wanted to admit. He stood up and walked to the piano, sat on the bench, patted the space beside him. She didn't move at first. "Sir, I really shouldn't." "Please," he said. "Just for a minute." After a moment, she stepped forward, sat on the very edge of the bench like she might bolt at any second. He didn't ask her to play, just said, "Show me how you remember it." She looked at him uncertain. "It's okay," he said. "No one's listening but us." Slowly, she placed her hands on the keys, took a breath, and played not the full lullaby, just the opening phrase. C, E, G, then a soft descent, simple, heartbreaking. When she finished, she pulled her hands back like she'd been burned. "It's not perfect," she murmured. "It's perfect," he said. And for the first time she smiled, not the polite professional smile she used with staff or guests. A real one, small, fragile, but real. They sat in silence for a while after that. Not awkward, just present. Finally she stood. "I should finish cleaning," he nodded. "Of course," but as she turned to leave, he said, "What's your name?" She paused. "May, May," he repeated. It felt strange on his tongue, too soft for the sharp edges of his world. "But right. Thank you, May." She gave a small nod and walked away. But this time her steps weren't as quiet. Not loud, just less afraid. Over the next few days, things changed. Slowly. Almost invisibly. He started leaving the piano open. Not as a test. As an invitation. She never played when he was in the room. But sometimes late at night he'd hear it again. Just a few notes drifting down the hall like a secret. And he'd lie in bed listening, feeling something inside him loosen like a knot he didn't know was there. One afternoon he found her in the kitchen making tea. Not for him, for herself. A small ritual. Hot water, a paper packet of green tea, a chipped mug she must have brought from home. He leaned against the doorway. "You work late every night?" She startled, then relaxed when she saw him. "Only until everything's done. You don't have to do it all in one shift," he said. "You could come during the day." She shook her head. "Night is better. Fewer people, less watching." He understood. In a place like this, every glance felt like judgment. Every movement was observed. She preferred the cover of darkness where she could be herself without an audience. "How long have you been in the city?" he asked. 3 years, she said, stirring her tea. "Came right after my brother got sick." "Your brother?" She nodded. "He has a heart condition. Needs surgery. Expensive." She said it plainly, without self-pity. "Just fact. And the piano?" he asked gently. "Did you study it?" "A little. In my village there was an old teacher. She had a broken upright piano. We'd take turns playing. I wasn't good, but I loved it." She smiled faintly. "She said I had ear, whatever that means." "It means you hear the music inside you," he said. She looked at him, surprised again. He realized then how rarely anyone had spoken to her like this, like she was a person, not a function. That night, instead of pretending to sleep, he left a note on the piano bench. Just 2 words, "Play any time." The next morning, the note was gone. But the piano was open, and on the bench sat a single sheet of music, handwritten in careful script. The lullaby. All the way through, he didn't know how to read music. But he recognized the shape of the notes, and he knew without a doubt that she'd written it for him. Not as a maid, not as staff, as someone who understood grief, and memory, and the quiet ways we keep the people we love alive. He sat at the piano and traced the notes with his finger, as if touching them might bring back his mother's voice. It didn't. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in missing her. And somewhere in the city, a young woman was working another shift, sending money home, carrying her own weight, and maybe, just maybe, feeling a little less invisible. Because in that penthouse high above the noise of the world, 2 strangers had found a language that didn't need words, just a lullaby, and the courage to listen. The days began to blur together in a way Elias hadn't expected. Mornings still started with emails and conference calls, but now there was something else underneath it all. A quiet hum of awareness. like a second heartbeat in the background of his life. He found himself glancing at the clock not to track meetings but to see how close it was to evening, when the penthouse would grow still, and May would arrive. He didn't speak to her much during the day. She kept to her routine, and he respected that. But small things changed. He stopped leaving his jacket slung over the armchair. He made sure his coffee cup went straight into the dishwasher. Not because he was trying to impress her, but because he didn't want to add to her load. It felt wrong somehow to make someone who carried so much carry even more. One rainy Tuesday, he came home early, something almost unheard of, and found her in the hallway, kneeling beside a side table, carefully wiping up a spill. But it wasn't coffee or water. It was clear liquid, and the sharp scent of glass cleaner hung in the air. "What happened?" he asked. She flinched, then looked up, eyes wide. I knocked over the vase," she said quickly, voice tight. "I'm so sorry. I'll replace it," he frowned. "The Ming vase?" She nodded, not meeting his eyes. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered the shards into a dustpan. But something didn't add up. The vase had been on a high shelf out of normal reach, and May was careful, painfully so. He'd watched her move through the penthouse like she was walking on ice. This didn't feel like an accident. Still, he said nothing, just nodded and walked away. Later that night, long after she'd left, he checked the security footage, not out of suspicion this time, but concern. He pulled up the hallway camera from that afternoon. There she was, standing on a small step stool, reaching for a book on the top shelf. Her elbow brushed the vase. It wobbled, fell, shattered. She froze, looked around like she expected punishment to rain down from the ceiling. Then, without hesitation, she cleaned it up, wrapped the pieces in cloth, and tucked them into her bag. He fast-forwarded to the next morning. Watched her leave the building, stop at a corner store, and come out with a paper receipt. He zoomed in. It was from an antique shop downtown. The amount, $850, his stomach dropped. She couldn't afford that. Not on her salary. Not with everything she was already paying for. He dug deeper. Called the staffing agency under the guise of a routine check-in. Casually asked about her background. They confirmed she'd been sending nearly half her wages overseas every month for her younger brother's medical treatments. The surgery had been delayed twice due to costs. She'd taken on extra shifts, even weekend work at another residence, just to keep up. And now this vase, something she'd broken by accident, she was paying for out of her own pocket, terrified that admitting it might cost her the job. He sat back in his chair, stunned. This wasn't just dignity. This was sacrifice, and he'd been so wrapped up in his own world that he hadn't seen it. The next evening, he waited for her in the living room. Not on the sofa, not pretending, just standing by the window, hands in his pockets, watching the rain slide down the glass. When she arrived, she hesitated in the doorway. "Sir, is everything all right?" He turned. "May, come in." She stepped inside, clutching her caddy like a shield. "I saw what happened with the vase," he said gently. Her face went pale. "I can explain." "You don't have to," he interrupted. "It was an accident. Things break. That's life, but I also saw you go to the antique shop," he said. "You didn't have to do that." She looked down, voice barely audible. "I couldn't just leave it. It was valuable, and it was my fault." "It was a thing," he said. "Not worth your peace of mind. Not worth your brother's medicine." She looked up sharply, eyes wide with shock. "You know about my brother?" He nodded, not because I was prying. "Because I care," she didn't answer, just stood there, tears welling but not falling. She blinked them back fast, like she wasn't allowed to cry on the job. He walked over to the piano, opened the bench, and pulled out a small envelope. He handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked, wary. "Your raise," he said. "Effective immediately. And better hours. No more midnight shifts unless you want them." She stared at the envelope like it might burn her. I can't accept this." "Why not?" "Because I didn't earn it." "You've earned it every day you've walked through that door carrying more than anyone should," he said quietly. "You've earned it by showing up when you're exhausted. By treating this place and the things in it with respect even when no one was watching. By playing a lullaby that healed something in me I didn't even know was broken." She swallowed hard. "I was just doing my job." "No," he said. "You were being human. And that's rarer than you think." She finally took the envelope, fingers trembling. But she didn't open it. just held it like it was a promise. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "There's one more thing." He walked to his study and returned with a small velvet box. Inside was a simple silver locket, his mother's. He'd kept it in a drawer for years, too painful to wear, too precious to give away. "I want you to have this," he said. She shook her head. "I can't take that. It's yours." "It belonged to someone who believed in kindness," he said. "And I think she'd want it with someone who lives it." May looked at the locket, then at him. Something passed between them. Not gratitude, not obligation, but understanding. She didn't put it on. Just closed the box gently and tucked it into her pocket. That night, for the first time, she didn't wait until he was asleep to play the piano. He was reading in the armchair when he heard it, the soft opening notes of the lullaby, clearer now, fuller. He didn't move, didn't speak, just listened as she played the whole piece slowly, carefully, like she was stitching something back together. When she finished, she turned to him. "I've been thinking," she said, "about your mother." "Did she teach you to play?" He shook his head. "She tried. I was too impatient. Always rushing off to build something, prove something. I thought music was soft, useless. And now I think it's the only thing that's kept this place from feeling like a museum." She smiled. "Maybe it's not too late to learn." He looked at the piano, then at her. "Would you teach me?" She hesitated. "I'm not a teacher." "You taught me how to listen," he said. "That's enough." She considered it, then nodded. "All right, but only if you promise not to quit when your fingers hurt." He laughed, really laughed, for the first time in years. Over the next week, their routine shifted again. She came earlier, stayed later, not because she had to, but because the space between them had softened. They'd sit at the piano after her shift ended, her guiding his hands over the keys, correcting his posture, laughing when he hit a wrong note. He learned that she loved jasmine tea, that she wrote letters to her brother every Sunday, that she could fix a leaky faucet better than his building's maintenance team. He told her about growing up in a small apartment with a mother who worked 2 jobs but still found time to play piano every night. About how he'd promised himself he'd never struggle like that, and in doing so, had lost the very things that made struggle worth it. One evening, as they practiced a simple scale, she asked, "Why did you really pretend to sleep that first night?" He didn't dodge the question. "Because I didn't trust anyone." "Not really. I thought everyone wanted something from me. Money, access, secrets. I thought you might be the same. And now I think you're the only person in this city who doesn't want anything from me," he said. "Except maybe for me to press the right key." She smiled. "Even that's too much to ask." They both laughed. But beneath the laughter was something deeper, a quiet trust, built note by note, moment by moment. He started checking in on her brother. Not intrusively, just asking, "How's he doing?" Or did the clinic call back? He even made a quiet donation to the hospital under an anonymous name, enough to cover the remaining balance for the surgery. He didn't tell her, not yet. He wanted it to be a surprise when the time was right. One night, as she packed up to leave, she paused at the door. "You know," she said softly, "most people in your position, they wouldn't see someone like me." "Not really. I didn't," he admitted. "Not at first. What changed?" He thought about it. "You played a song I thought I'd never hear again. And in that moment I realized I'd been living in a house full of things, but empty of sound." She nodded like she understood exactly what he meant. Then she left, but this time she didn't close the door all the way, just left it slightly ajar, as if to say, "I'll be back." And he knew she would, because they weren't employer and employee anymore. They were 2 people, healing in the same room, one quiet note at a time. The rain had been falling for 3 days straight, steady, gray and quiet, like the city itself was holding its breath. Elias sat by the window, a half-finished cup of tea cooling on the table beside him. He wasn't working, not today. The board had approved the merger. His inbox was quiet, and for once, the world outside his penthouse felt distant, muffled by the downpour. But his mind wasn't calm. Something had been building inside him for weeks, something he couldn't ignore anymore. It wasn't guilt exactly, not shame. It was heavier than that. It was the weight of a truth he'd been avoiding. He'd watched her, tested her, judged her before he even knew her name, and she'd responded not with anger, not with resentment, but with grace so quiet it had reshaped the very air in his home. He couldn't keep pretending that was okay. That evening, when he heard the familiar soft chime of the service elevator, he didn't wait in the living room. He met her in the hallway. She looked surprised to see him standing there, still in his sweater and slacks, no tie, hair slightly messy from running his hands through it all afternoon. "Sir?" she said, shifting her caddy to her other hand. "Can we talk?" he asked. She nodded slowly, eyes cautious but not afraid. Not anymore. He led her to the small sitting area near the kitchen, cozy, warm, far from the grand formality of the main living room. 2 armchairs, a low table, a lamp casting a soft golden glow. He gestured for her to sit. She did, perching on the edge like she always did, ready to leave at a moment's notice. He took a breath. "I need to tell you something." She waited, silent. "That first night," he began, voice low. "When you played the piano." "I wasn't asleep." Her eyes widened just slightly. Not with shock, more like quiet confirmation. As if she'd suspected all along. "I pretended to be," he continued. "I wanted to see what you'd do when you thought no one was watching. I thought maybe you'd go through my things, take photos, steal something. I've been burned before." She didn't look away, didn't flinch. "Just listened. I was wrong," he said. "So completely wrong. You didn't take anything. You gave something instead, a memory, a piece of your heart. And I watched it happen like a thief in my own home." He looked down at his hands. "I'm sorry, May, not just for doubting you, but for treating you like a risk instead of a person." For a long moment she said nothing. Then softly, "You had every right to be careful." He looked up, surprised. "People in your position." "They have to be," she said. "I understand that. My brother's doctor once told me that trust is a luxury some can't afford. I didn't take it personally." Her words hit him harder than anger ever could. "But it wasn't just about being careful," he said. "It was about me not seeing you. Not really. I saw a maid. A role, a function. I didn't see the woman who plays lullabies to remember her mother, who works 3 jobs to save her brother, who replaces broken vases with her own money because she thinks she's not allowed to make mistakes." She looked down, fingers twisting the hem of her sleeve. "I didn't want to lose this job." "You won't," he said firmly. "Not because I say so, but because you've earned your place here, not as staff, but as someone who belongs." She finally met his eyes. There was no bitterness there, just a quiet sadness, like she'd carried this weight so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. "I played that song because I felt it," she said after a pause. "When I walked into this apartment for the first time, it felt empty. Not cold, just quiet in a sad way, like someone had stopped living here a long time ago. And when I saw the piano covered in dust, I knew. Someone loved it once, and then stopped." She looked at him. "I played because I hoped, maybe, that if I played the right notes, someone might remember how to feel again." He swallowed hard. His throat felt tight. "I did," he whispered. They sat in silence for a while, the rain tapping gently against the windows like a lullaby of its own. Then, hesitantly, she added, "My mother played that same tune every night before bed. She'd sit me on her lap, and I'd rest my head on her shoulder while her fingers moved over the keys. I didn't understand the music then. I just knew it meant I was safe." Her voice cracked slightly. "After she passed, I couldn't hear it for years. It hurt too much. But when I saw your piano, it was like she was whispering to me again, telling me it was okay to remember." Elias didn't know what to say, so he didn't say anything. He just let her words hang in the air, sacred and true. After a while, she stood. "I should get back to work." "Wait," he said. "There's something else." He walked to the study and returned with a thick envelope. Not the kind for bills or letters. This one was official-looking with a hospital logo in the corner. She took it, confused. "Open it," he said gently. She did. Her eyes scanned the page, then widened. Her hands began to shake. This can't be real," she whispered. "It is," he said. "The surgery's been approved. Fully covered. No copays, no waiting list. They're scheduling it for next month." Tears spilled over before she could stop them. She covered her mouth with one hand, the envelope clutched in the other like a lifeline. You did this?" He nodded. "I wanted to wait until it was certain, until there was no chance of it falling through." She looked at him, tears streaming silently down her face. Why? Because you've given me back something I thought I'd lost, he said. And I wanted to give you back your brother. She didn't speak for a long time. Just stood there, breathing through the storm of emotion. Then slowly she stepped forward and hugged him. It wasn't dramatic, not theatrical. Just a simple human embrace, brief, warm, full of everything words couldn't say. When she pulled back, she wiped her eyes and managed a small, wobbly smile. Thank you, she said. Not just for this. For seeing me. I'm the one who should thank you, he said. For reminding me that people aren't problems to be solved. They're stories to be heard. She nodded, then tucked the envelope carefully into her bag like it was made of glass. That night, she didn't clean, not right away. Instead, she sat at the piano and played not the lullaby, but something new, lighter, hopeful, a melody he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. He sat in the armchair and listened, not as a CEO, not as a man in control, but as someone finally learning how to be still. After she left, he walked to the piano and placed his mother's locket on the music stand, where she'd see it next time. The next morning, he called his assistant. Cancel my afternoon meetings, he said. I'll be teaching myself piano. His assistant laughed. Since when do you play? Since I realize some things are more important than profit margins, he said. And for the first time, he meant it. Over the next few days, May seemed different. Not just lighter, though she was, but more present. She hummed while she worked. Left little notes on the counter. Try pressing C with your thumb, it's easier. Or, don't rush the rhythm. Music isn't a race, he followed her advice. Practiced every evening. His fingers were clumsy, his timing off, but he kept going. Because every wrong note reminded him that growth isn't about perfection. It's about showing up. Even when you're afraid you'll fail. One afternoon, he found her in the kitchen, on the phone in her native language. Her voice was soft, full of a joy he hadn't heard before. When she hung up, she turned to him, eyes shining. He got the letter, she said. He's going to be okay, Elias smiled. Tell him to rest. And tell him, someone here is rooting for him. She nodded, then paused. You know, you could come. To the hospital. When it happens, he was surprised. Would that be all right? He'd like to meet the man who gave him a second chance, she said simply. He didn't say yes right away. But he didn't say no either because something had shifted, not just between them but within him. He wasn't just a man in a penthouse anymore. He was part of a story now, a real one. Messy, tender, uncertain. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. Later that night, as he practiced a simple scale, he realized something. He wasn't playing to impress anyone. Not his mother's memory. Not May, not even himself. He was playing because it felt like coming home. And somewhere down the hall, a quiet woman packed her bag, touched the locket in her pocket, and smiled, knowing that kindness once given never really leaves. It just finds new places to grow. The morning of the surgery dawned clear and bright, as if the sky itself had decided to offer a clean slate. Elias stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt. Not a crisp white one this time, but a soft blue button-down, the kind he usually saved for weekends. He hadn't slept much. Not from anxiety, but from something quieter, anticipation. He was about to step into a world he hadn't visited in years, the world of hospitals, waiting rooms and the fragile, hope that lives in the space between heartbeats. He picked up the small gift bag on the entryway table, just a book of illustrated folktales and a handwritten note, and headed out. The hospital was nothing like his penthouse. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The air smelled of antiseptic and coffee. People moved with tired purpose, faces drawn but determined. He felt out of place at first, like a man who'd forgotten how to speak the language of ordinary life. But then he saw her. May sat in a plastic chair near the nurse's station, hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the double doors marked surgery, authorized personnel only. She wore a simple dress, no uniform, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger this way, less guarded, more herself. When she saw him, she stood quickly. You came. I said I would, he replied. She nodded, but her eyes shimmered. He's already in there. They said it'll take about 3 hours. He sat beside her. How are you holding up? As long as he's breathing, I'm breathing, she said simply. They didn't talk much after that, just sat in the quiet rhythm of shared waiting. He noticed how she checked her watch every few minutes, how her fingers tapped a silent rhythm on her knee, C, e.g. over and over like a prayer. At one point, a nurse came out and gave an update. Everything was going smoothly. May exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for days. He's strong, Elias said. He has to be, she whispered. He's all I've got. And you're all he's got, Elias added gently. That's a kind of strength, too. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not just gratitude but trust, deep and quiet, like roots beneath the soil. When the surgeon finally emerged, smiling, saying the words, "And it went perfectly," May burst into tears, not sad ones, but the kind that come when a weight you've carried for years finally lifts. Elias didn't say anything, just handed her a tissue and stood quietly while she composed herself. Later they were allowed to see him. Her brother was pale, hooked to monitors, but his eyes were open, bright with relief. When he saw Elias, he tried to sit up. No, Elias said, stepping forward. You stay right there. The boy, because that's what he still was, barely 20, smiled weakly. Thank you, he said in careful English. For my sister. For me, Elias shook his head. Your sister did all the hard work. I just cleared a path. The boy looked at May, then back at Elias. You're a good man. Elias didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. On the way home, neither of them spoke much. But the silence wasn't empty. It was full of relief, of possibility, of a future that hadn't been guaranteed just hours before. Back at the penthouse, everything felt different. Not because the furniture had moved or the view had changed, but because the air itself seemed lighter, as if the walls had finally learned how to breathe. That evening, Elias didn't wait for May to arrive. He sat at the piano himself, fingers hovering over the keys. He played the lullaby, slowly, carefully, hitting a few wrong notes but finishing the whole thing. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. When she walked in, she stopped in the doorway and listened. When he finished, she smiled. You're getting better. I had a good teacher, he said. She came over and sat beside him on the bench. Let me show you something. She placed her hands over his, guiding his fingers into position. Don't think about the notes, she said softly. Think about the feeling. Music isn't in the keys. It's in the space between them. He followed her lead, and this time it didn't feel like practice. It felt like conversation. After a while, she pulled back. You know, I used to think people like you lived in a different world, one I'd never understand. And now? He asked. Now I think we're all just trying to find our way back to something real, she said. Some of us just take longer paths. He looked at her, really looked, and saw not a maid, not an employee, but a woman who carried love like a compass, who turned grief into grace, who played lullabies in the dark just to keep someone else's memory alive. I'm glad you walked into my life, he said. I'm glad you let me stay, she replied. Weeks passed. Her brother recovered quickly, stronger every day. He started coming during daylight hours now, no longer hiding in the shadows of midnight. She'd hum while dusting the shelves, leave little stacks of sheet music on the piano, even bring in a small potted jasmine plant that bloomed with tiny white flowers and filled the room with a sweet, quiet fragrance. Elias, in turn, began leaving the city more often, not for business, but for walks in the park, for coffee at a corner cafe, for sitting on a bench just to watch people live their messy, beautiful lives. He even started saying good morning to the doorman instead of just nodding. One Sunday morning, sunlight streaming through the windows, he sat at the piano again. This time he wasn't practicing. He was playing for her. It was still the lullaby, but slower, softer, with a tenderness he hadn't known he possessed. When he finished, she was standing in the kitchen doorway, wiping her hands on a towel, eyes glistening. You played it like your mother would have, she said. Or like yours, he replied. She walked over and placed a hand on the piano lid. You know, I think they'd have liked each other. I think so too. They stood there for a moment. Two people bound not by blood or title, but by a shared understanding. That kindness isn't weakness. That dignity doesn't need a spotlight, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply show up for someone else. Later that week, Elias made a quiet change. He told the staffing agency he wouldn't be renewing their contract. Not because he didn't need help, but because he wanted May to work directly for him, with full benefits, fair pay, and the respect she'd always deserved. She could even take time off to visit her brother without worrying about lost wages. When he told her, she didn't cry. She just nodded and said, "Thank you for seeing me." "No," he said. "Thank you for letting me." Time moved on. Seasons changed. The jasmine plant grew. The piano was played nearly every evening, sometimes by her, sometimes by him, sometimes together, their hands brushing over the keys like old friends. And the penthouse? It stopped feeling like a showcase. It started feeling like a home, not because of the view or the price tag or the polished floors, but because two people had decided, without fanfare or grand gestures, to be human with each other. One night, as they sat on the balcony watching the city lights flicker below, Elias asked, "Do you ever miss your village?" "Sometimes," she said. "But home isn't just a place. It's where you're allowed to be yourself." He looked at her, then at the piano through the glass doors, then at the quiet life they'd built in the space between suspicion and trust. "I think we found it," he said. She smiled. "I think we did." And in that moment, high above the noise of the world, there was no CEO, no maid, just two people finally at peace, listening to the music they'd made together.